page besties, my name is Brittany. This is Rescues and Reads. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you are new, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And if you're already subscribed, as always, I appreciate your continued support. Thank you for returning to another video. Today we are here to talk about some authors that I discovered, whether they were just new to me or debut authors in 2024 that I cannot wait to read more of. One of my favorite things to track every single year during my reading are new authors that I have enjoyed so much that they've maybe immediately become auto-buy authors, or maybe I just enjoyed their books so much that I definitely want to dip my toes into their backlist. And so those are the authors that we are going to talk about here today. Now, I will say that 2024 was definitely the year of repeat authors for me. I think roughly about 2/3 of the books that I read in 2024 were repeat authors. And I'm not mad about that statistic because it meant that I was reading authors that I knew that I loved. It meant that I was finishing or making progress in series. It meant that I was clearing my backlist. So that statistic I'm really, really proud of. And so for that reason, I didn't really have very many new to me or debut authors to select from for this video. And in all honesty, several of the new to me or debut authors that I did read in 2024, I wasn't necessarily super impressed by, or I'm not necessarily very excited to continue in their works. So there were definitely slim pickings this year, which is absolutely fine. I did manage to come up with a list of about, I would say 9 or 10 authors for you, and I think that's plenty. So I'm just gonna go ahead and briefly touch upon some of the authors that I discovered in 2024 and why I'm looking forward to reading more from them in 2025 and beyond. Now, this list is in absolutely no particular order. It's just in the order I thought of the authors. So the first author that I have here is Mariana Zapata. I had a very, very rocky history with Mariana Zapata. I had read fully one book by her. I think it was a book called Rhythm, Chord, and Melican or something to that effect. I absolutely hated it. I gave it a 2 stars. And there was another book that I had started by her just kind of casually. It wasn't really anything serious. I wanted to test the waters with her more a bit. And I only got a few pages in and ultimately like DNF'd it. I just didn't care about it, didn't think about it ever again. So I really didn't think that Mariana Zapata was the author for me, but literally any time that I ask for a slow burn romance, Mariana Zapata is almost always the first author that pops up in my recommendations. So when I started to do the whole Mission Impossible project, trying to find my next favorite romance or romance author, I decided to go ahead and give Mariana Zapata another shot. And that became more urgent when Fairy Loot announced these beautiful special editions that they were releasing of some of her more popular novels. So I was like, you know what, before I invest in this series, I really need to go ahead and read one of her books. So I decided to read All Roads Lead Here, which, as y'all know, that is not a small contemporary romance, y'all. That is about 600 pages. And thankfully, I really, really enjoyed it. I had a great time with it. It's kind of like a Grumpy Sunshine type of romance, and I just thought it was wonderful. Was it too long? Yes, absolutely. It could have easily been cut down by like 50 or even 100 pages. But for the most part, I thought Mariana Zapata used that space very, very well. There were some repetitive aspects to it, but they didn't really bother me. I ultimately enjoyed the relationship. I rooted for it. I loved the characters, and it definitely made me want to read more from Mariana Zapata. Now, I still have a disconnect with her writing because it is very casual, but for the most part, like I said, I really had a great time with All Roads Lead Here. I already have The Wall of Winnipeg and Me, and if all goes according to plan, I will be reading that in January. So hopefully I enjoy that one just as much, and Mariana Zapata can become a new favorite author for me. Next, I want to go ahead and spotlight TJ Newman. Now, I read both of the books this year that she had out prior to the release of her newest book called Worst Case Scenario. I read Falling earlier this year and then Drowning during Bookmas. And I had a great, great time with both of those books, but I especially loved Drowning. Now, from my understanding, TJ Newman is a former flight attendant, and she utilizes that experience with the writing of her books. Her books are very fast-paced, plot-driven thrillers. So they are just bang, bang, bang. They really throw you right in, and it's all about the action. And usually those types of books really do not work for me, but when I got into Drowning, that was one that really, really worked for me, and I was surprised at how much it worked for me because I wasn't expecting it to. Basically, from page 1, you are thrown into the action, and it doesn't really give you much time to adjust, but I ultimately ended up finding myself really emotionally investing in the story and the characters, and I think it takes a really talented author to do that for me. So I'm very much looking forward to reading Worst Case Scenario. I hope that I enjoy it as much as Drowning, and I hope that TJ Newman can quickly become like an auto-buy thriller author for me. Now, this next author, I'm only mentioning tentatively because she only has 2 books out and they are all within the same series. So my interest in her is primarily related to this series. I would have to see what, if anything, she comes out with in the future to determine if I do want to read more from her. But that, of course, is Hannah Nicole Mayer and the Assistant to the Villain series. I've read both Assistant and Apprentice to the Villain, and I do plan on reading Accomplice to the Villain when it comes out later this year. I already have it pre-ordered. That is a series that I've talked about ad nauseum on my channel since I first read Assistant to the Villain. I think it was in May of 2024. So I'm not going to go into detail about those books here, but I just have really, really enjoyed my reading experience of them. I absolutely love the characters, love the banter. It is just such a wonderful story. It's just like a hug in a book, in my opinion. I just find them and the characters in the books absolutely delightful. And I know that there are going to be several other books in this series. I think I heard somebody mention that there were going to be like at least 5. I don't necessarily know if I think the series needs 5 books, but I will probably read them all, of course. And if Hannah Nicole Mayer were to come out with another series, I would probably give it a shot. All I know is that I'm very intrigued based on my 2 experiences that I've had within this series about what she's going to do next. In a similar vein, I also want to talk about Khloe Walsh because, as y'all know, I read Binding 13 and Keeping 13 this year, and those were by far some of the biggest reading surprises that I had last year. I was not expecting to love those as much as I did, especially because I was 30% of the way into Binding 13 and I was considering DNFing it, but by 50% I was absolutely hooked, and by the end of Binding 13 I was in such a chokehold I had to continue with Keeping 13, and that never happens. This is classified as a YA contemporary/contemporary romance, and y'all know that I really don't read YA anymore, so I was very skeptical and hesitant going into these stories, but literally everybody who talks about these stories loves them. They rave about them and they say that they are absolutely going to break your heart, and I can fully agree. There are some serious, harder hitting topics in this story. There's incredibly serious and traumatizing bullying, there's alcoholism, there's domestic violence, there is all kinds of horrific things happening in here, primarily to the main character Shannon. It's all about her relationship with Johnny, who is a star rugby player at their school, and the safety that she finds with him. That is why I loved Johnny Kavanaugh so much, is because he was her safe place and he was going to do absolutely anything he could to help her. Nobody is going to deny that these books are entirely too long. I think they both could easily have been cut down by like 200 pages and it would still have been a satisfying story because there were a lot of redundant and repetitive elements in here. But at the same time, it almost made me feel like I was watching one of those nostalgic teen melodramas from the late 90s, early aughts, like Dawson's Creek, One Tree Hill, and things of that nature. So it didn't bother me too much because of that experience. So I wouldn't say that these books are perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they are incredibly hard hitting and I just love them so much. And I already have the next one and I plan on reading that at some point in 2025. And I'm very excited, although a little bit nervous because I know that they're going to be difficult reads. And I also know that I'm going to be sucked into them. And I have to be in a space where I can afford to be sucked into a book like that, because Binding 13 and Keeping 13 had my full attention for 9 days. I didn't read anything else. I completely ignored my TBR. I just read those 2 books. And I think if an author can do that for me, I think that's a sign that I need to give her another chance. So whenever she puts out something outside of the Boys of Tom, I would like to see what she could do in the adult age range, because I think that she could probably write incredibly harder hitting adult romances, and I would certainly love to see it. So I would say that Khloe Walsh is another author that I am tentatively interested in right now just based on this series, but I could love more that she writes in the future. Another author that I am very interested to read more from is Ariel Lan. My first experience with her was one of the first books that I read in 2024. That was The Frozen River, and that was an exceptional historical fiction. I typically stick to World War II historical fiction just because I love that area of history and I love reading books about it, but this was such a nice, refreshing change of pace. It was set in the late 1800s, so after the American Revolution, and it follows a midwife and her experiences in this small, I think it was a Maine town that she lives in with her husband and her children, and she's a very respected midwife, but then like a murder happens and she's trying to help solve it, and she gets a lot of skepticism and sexism during this time, and she was just such a strong, powerful woman. I loved watching her work and seeing her relationship with her husband as well. It was just such a compelling story, and it certainly made me want to read more from her in the future. I know she has a couple of backlist titles, but I've heard amazing things about a book called I Was Anastasia, and I definitely think I want to give that a try, as well as Codenamed Helene. I am very particular about the historical fictions that I pick up, but I think that if I read a backlist of hers and enjoy it just as much as The Frozen River, I think that she could absolutely become an auto-buy historical fiction author for me. That's how much I really love Frozen River. Like I said, I've heard amazing things about her backlist, and so I will absolutely be trying at least one of those, and certainly books that she releases in the future. J.H. Mercur is another author that I'm really intrigued by. I had never heard of this author before, but their book Sleep Tight was featured on Book of the Month, and because it was classified as a thriller, I had to pick it up for a year-long project that I was doing, and I was pleasantly surprised by it. I really enjoyed it. Now, I've heard almost everybody else who has read this book have a lot of criticism about it, or they didn't enjoy it for whatever reason, but I kind of disagree with a lot of their assessments on it. So I think that if you are interested in the synopsis of this, you should definitely go for it. Now, there were certainly some weirder aspects to this. There was kind of like a cult, and there was a key player in here who had dissociative identity disorder, but for the most part, I had a great time with this. I thought it was really compelling. I thought it was really well woven, and I am certainly willing to read more from J.H. Mercur in the future. In fact, I will actively be looking out for their books in the future. Another Another one that I'm very, very much looking forward to trying again is C.J. Cook. I read Book of the Witching, which again was another Book of the Month book, and I absolutely adored it. The witchy vibes in that story were absolutely phenomenal. One perspective was told in the present when a mother receives a call that her daughter, who I think was like 19 or 20, who was on a hiking trip with friends, has wound up in the hospital with severe burns. And her best friend is missing and her boyfriend is dead. And this mother does not know what happened. And so she's trying to piece together everything that happened. And then meanwhile, you're also getting a perspective from the late 1500s and a woman who was accused of being a witch on this island where the main character's daughter had experienced her burns and stuff like that. So I just found it incredibly engaging, incredibly compelling. I loved both perspectives equally. I found them very, very fascinating. And like I said, the vibes were immaculate. So I have definitely gone back and added some of CJ Cook's backlist onto my TBR. I'm excited to get to more from her, hopefully this year at some point. And I do know that she has a new release coming out in 2025, which I will certainly be getting to. Now, if I understand correctly, CJ Cook also writes under the pen name of Caro Carver. And I read Bad Tourist by Caro Carver, yet again, another Book of the Month book. And I had a great time with it. It wasn't anything like super remarkable or anything, but it was a fun time in the moment. And I don't really have too terribly much complaints about it. I enjoyed it more than I thought that I would. So I think that Caro Carver both and CJ Cook could be an author that I keep an eye on in the future. And these last two are kind of tentative. So the first one that I have is Jessica Null. I read Bright Young Women by Jessica Null as part of the collaboration that I did with Sarah earlier in 2024. And I really did enjoy it because this was basically a take on Ted Bundy's victims. Although Ted Bundy is never named in this story, we all know that is who the serial killer was in this story, right? But this was primarily focused on the victims. And so you're getting the perspective of a woman who was there at the time that he did his sorority killings. And then you're also following the perspective of a woman, I think she was in Colorado, who eventually becomes one of his victims. So you know from the start that she is essentially going to be killed by Ted Bundy in this book. And I thought it was incredibly compelling the way that she told it. I loved her focus on the victims, but I did have some technical issues with the story. So while I do think that it was really well written and I was very intrigued by the subject matter, it wasn't a perfect read for me. And I have never had any interest in Jessica Null's backlist. In fact, I've actively heard terrible things about the other, I think, 2 books that she has. So I have never been interested in her in the past, but based on my experience with Bright Young Women, I would be willing to give her a chance. So she's not necessarily an author that I'm super crazy excited about trying again, but she is an author that I did enjoy in 2024 and I would be willing to read more from her in the future. And similarly, I wanted to briefly mention Amy Tintera. Book of the Month featured Listen for the Lie as one of their selections, and that was another one that I had a great time with. I had never heard of Amy Tintera before. She had never been on my radar. I knew nothing of what to expect going in, but this is another one that I had a remarkable time with. Features a woman who people say that she killed her best friend, but she honestly does not remember if she did or not. She doesn't think that she's a murderer, but she doesn't remember. So she has to think that there could be some kind of possibility, right? And there is a podcast going on about what happened. And so you're actually following our main character working with this podcaster because she wants to know just as much as everybody else does. And she has this really spunky grandmother who was one of the best characters in the story. I thought that was a lot of fun. The narration was phenomenal. It was not a full cast narration, but I feel like the narrators did a really good job of kind of making you feel like it was a full cast, if that makes sense. And I even appreciated the ending. It wasn't necessarily anything mind-blowing, but I didn't mind the direction where it went. I've heard a lot of people had issues with the ending. I'm not entirely sure why, but I overall had a really great reading experience with this one. And so while Amy Tintera is not necessarily on this list as an author that I'm crazy excited to try more from, I definitely do want to read more books from her because if I could have that great of an experience with Listen for the Lie, I think I could have just as good of an experience with more of her books in the future. All right, everyone, that is it. Those are some of the new to me / debut authors that I discovered in 2024 that I'm looking forward to trying more from in 2025 and beyond. Please comment down below and let me know some new to you or debut authors that you discovered in 2024. I would love to know. Or if you made it to the end of this video and you are not feeling chatty, go ahead and leave me a fire emoji down below. And as always, if you like this video or if you just like me, please be sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. I typically post 2 videos a week, one on Wednesdays, one on Sundays, and I would love to connect with you in any of those future videos. Or if you'd like to connect with me outside of YouTube, you can find links to my Goodreads, Instagram, and Patreon linked down below along with any books featured in this video. Until next time, y'all. Bye.